So I would like to, in the same vein, I would like to ask you a question related to critical period hypothesis. Professor Noam Chomsky, how have your ideas on critical period hypothesis changed over the years? Are you more or less convinced to the theory now than you were initially?
Well, my main interest is this process of virtually reflexive development of language as the flowering of internal competence and principles. And over the years, we have learned a lot about the nature of this internal system. It has, at the very beginning, say 60, 70 years ago, there was a conundrum which has guided research in many ways. There seems to be a serious contradiction in the enterprise of trying to determine what is the internal given basis for knowledge of language and development of language. On the one hand, it seems that it has to be quite complex. The reason is because of what's called poverty of stimulus. The data available to a child doesn't come anywhere close to the wealth of knowledge that a child actually has at every stage of development from 1 year old on. It's easy to show that by experiment with children, that what they know and understand is way beyond any experience they've had. That suggests strongly that the internal system must be very rich in order to account for the gap between sparse data and rich knowledge. That's one prong of the dilemma. The other has to do with the evolution of language. It wasn't very well known 70 years ago. It's increasingly been learned that language emerged in the human species within a very narrow window of time.
Interesting.
We now have strong evidence, genomic evidence, that humans, Homo sapiens, began to separate almost very shortly after they'd emerged. Humans began to appear in the biological record about 200,000 or 300,000 years ago. That's a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. And very soon they began to separate. But all the separated groups have the same language faculty. So that means it was already in place before the separation. There is no evidence for any meaningful symbolic activity prior to the emergence of some Homo sapiens, which, put that together, gives you a strong evidence that the capacity for language, which is the basis for our thinking, our reflection, our imagining, planning, everything, our creativity, everything we do, all seems to have emerged along with Homo sapiens. That's a very brief window of time.
Yep.
That suggests that the internal system must be very simple because it emerged so quickly. Nature would have just picked the simplest solution when the problem arose of developing a system with an infinite range of possible expressive devices, which is unique to humans. So when that change took place in the genetic material, nature would have picked the simplest answer to it, which is apparently the one that stayed with no changes. So we have a contradiction. Learning or development of language seems to require a very rich system. The evolution of language seems to require a very simple system. That's been a lot of research over the last 70 years has been an effort to resolve this problem. We're now about at a point where you can see an answer, where you can see how extremely simple mechanisms can give very rich consequences when you bring into account principles of computational efficiency, general principles of the structure of complex devices and so on.
Interesting.
That's the major change that's taken place, I think. And I think we're probably now on the verge of a new and quite exciting phase in the study of language and thought. And I mentioned the two because they're about the same. We really have no concept of thinking outside of linguistically articulated thinking. The two capacities, language and thought, seem to be essentially the same. And there are both species properties of human beings, common to the species, everywhere, no difference is known, unique to the species, no trace of it in any other organism. And we're finally beginning to get a grasp on how that language thought system might have emerged suddenly and might have the capacity to overcome the extraordinary gap, huge gap between data presented and knowledge attained. That's, I think, the primary development in linguistic theory over the past 60, 70 years.
Yes, you want, Professor Krashen, you want to say something?
About critical periods. I have a hypothesis about what's going on. I like to believe, I would love to believe that the language acquisition device never shuts off, that it's always there. And I started thinking about this in the 1960s when I was teaching school in Ethiopia, and I met a guy there named Gerald Mosbach from UK, and we had an interesting conversation. He said that when he was in secondary school, they all did French, and he hated it. It was poor methodology, boring. He hated the teachers. He hated the French language. He hated the French culture. Now, to make things worse, you had to do an oral examination in front of all your teachers at the end, which is the worst torture you can do for an impressionable teenage guy speaking another language. So he decided he would show his disdain for the language, the culture, and the school. He came in by humiliating everybody. He came in with dressed French, with a beret, with a glass of some liquid, pretending it was wine. And he did what he thought was foolishly exaggerate a French accent. He said, bonjour, mesdames, messieurs, je suis très content d'être ici avec vous. Comment ça va aujourd'hui, hein? And his teachers said, wow, why weren't you doing that during the year? That was fantastic. Your accent is great. He could do that trying to make fun of his teachers, but he couldn't do that ordinarily. I found out later that Peter Ustinov, famous, wonderful actor, did movies in French where his French was totally convincing. He said, I can't do that outside when I have a conversation. Conclusion, language signals what group you're a member of. That's its, accent is the way, one powerful way of doing that. And if you're not a member of the group that uses the language, you have a hard time using that accent. When I meet someone from the UK, I don't suddenly start speaking with a British accent. I find it extremely difficult to do. Versions I've heard all my life, I cannot imitate, or I'm very uncomfortable in doing so. It's club membership. Maybe accent does not obey the critical period. Maybe we have what we might call an output filter instead.
Interesting. Thank you very much. In the same vein, professors, so what's the relevance of the critical period for English speaking proficiency among immigrants? Don't you think the same way kids acquire?
Yeah, I think the implication is not to worry about it at all. They're going to get the accent of their friends, people they feel comfortable with. They're not going to get the accent of the teacher that's been shown over and over again. And there's not much we can or should do about it. This will make them comfortable when the need comes out or the feeling comes out that they should talk a slightly different way. Okay, my colleague Nushan Ashtari told me that when she was a young girl, she became a tomboy. She's not anymore, but that was the role. There was a special language they used, a special way of speaking that she wouldn't use now. I'm telling you this because you know all about it. It happens to all of us. Don't worry about it. Teaching it won't help. I've looked at the research on teaching accent. It's the same as teaching grammar. You've got to be focused on certain forms. It's limited to simple rules, etc. And when your mind is off it, you can't do it. So I would say, let's not worry about it.